Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Live with NORML. I'm J.M. Padini, the Development Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Friday, February 28th, 2025. You know what that means, friends? It's time for us to answer all of your burning questions live. We have some special fun in store for you today. Paul Armentano, NORML's Deputy Director, is going to be joining us in just a minute. But first, let me say hello to you all, and why don't you take a quick second, drop a note in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from, and start thinking about those questions. We have a lot of state issues that we are going to talk about today. So I know that usually you all have great questions about what's going on in your state, and we're ready for them this week. Hello, Kentucky NORML. Thank you for joining us. Hey, doctor. All right, friends. Hey, thanks everyone on Instagram who just joined us. Hey, Comfy in Ohio. Hey, David. Welcome back. Hope you're having a good Friday down there in Norfolk. Hey, Chris out in Tidewater. Hey, Jennifer in California. Hey, Nick. Good to see you, friend. Unhappy in Australia on Instagram. Hello. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Grateful in New York. Hey, Canna Lovers in Alexandria. All right, friends. Let's go ahead and welcome Paul. Let me add Paul in here. Let me unmute you, Paul. Hey, Paul.
Hey there.
What's going on?
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you. Hey, mams. right out of the gate. Right out of the gate. And Paul, this is something you and I were talking about just before we started the show. So I'm going to answer this question real quick. Hey, mams. Good to see you as always. Despite what I can tell you've been on Twitter because we were just talking about this, and that tweet's gone. I will tell you that. So here's what happened. Somebody tweeted that apparently Governor Youngkin was talking with the bill patrons of the adult use retail sales measures in Virginia, and that there was some sort of deal in the works. And if you happen to catch the response to that tweet, you would have known, in fact, that no, that's not what's happening. And now that tweet is gone, shockingly. One of the bill patrons, Delegate Krizek, responded to it, actually, in case you missed that, mams. But no. Our governor in Virginia has not reached out to the bill patrons, according to the bill patrons, has not reached out in reference to any sort of deal. So we are all expecting a veto for that.
JM, I think you file that under the wishful thinking file.
I think we file it under the clickbait.
That too.
That's just another day, another fire drill. What can we say? Hey, Fred, happy Friday to you up in Northern Virginia. Hey, Matt in Georgia. Hey, I'm going to read through some more comments, and this is a great one for you to warm up with, Paul. Matt says, hello from McDonough, Georgia. It's well known that cannabis has a lot of medical benefits. Why can't the scheduling be challenged based on known medical benefits?
So it's a good question. So there are different ways to challenge the scheduling of a drug. Congress can introduce legislation to move drug from one category of the Controlled Substances Act to another. And from time to time that happens. In fact, folks may be aware that within the last few days, members of the House of Representatives passed legislation to move fentanyl, which is right now a Schedule II drug, to be a Schedule I substance. So that is one way a change can occur. The other way it can occur is through the administrative petition process. And when one files one of those petitions, the petition goes to the Department of Health and Human Services. They then perform a review of the scientific record. And if they think that the available science is inconsistent with where a substance is currently placed in the CSA, they may issue a recommendation for it to be moved. If they think the science is consistent with where the drug is currently placed, then they issue a recommendation that it stays in the same category where it currently is filed. Once HHS makes their recommendation, it then goes to DEA. DEA then does their own review, and they either confirm or they reject HHS's recommendation, and DEA's decision on this matter is final. As folks are probably aware, there have been historically 5 different rescheduling challenges to move marijuana out of Schedule 1. NORML filed the first ever rescheduling challenge in 1972. That did not lead to a review until 1986, and it led to a DEA decision in 1988. That decision was ultimately set aside by the agency in 1990, and marijuana remains in Schedule 1 because of the DEA's rejection of that decision. There was a most recent rescheduling petition that was filed on behalf of the Biden administration a couple of years ago. That led to HHS issuing a recommendation that marijuana does, in fact, have medical value and should not be in Schedule 1. The DEA was in the process of reviewing that decision. There was an administrative hearing or trial that was scheduled before the DEA, but that trial is now on hold. And the DEA, as it has always been, has been opposing any change in moving marijuana's scheduled status. The DEA is of the opinion that medical value is solely defined by FDA approval. And because the FDA has never approved botanical cannabis, the DEA therefore says it has no medical value, and therefore they have recommended it stays in Schedule 1.
There we are. Hey, Samuel, I didn't mean to share your comment, but I hope you're having a great day also. What do I want to take? What do I want to tackle? Oh, there we go. Here's a little follow-up for you, Paul. Mams is asking, would HHS or DEA squash the rescheduling in the current political environment?
Yeah, so right now, the current administrative petition is out of HHS's hands. HHS made its recommendation that marijuana be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. By them doing that, that then put this within the jurisdiction of the DEA. The DEA then called for administrative hearings to essentially further review and potentially oppose HHS's recommendation. Those hearings were scheduled to begin in January. There were a number of things that the DEA, political maneuvering, legal maneuvering that the DEA did in the weeks running up to those hearings that proponents of rescheduling thought were improper. They asked the judge to look into the DEA's activities, and the judge in this case, who is a judge appointed by the DEA, thought that the Drug Enforcement Administration's behaviors were so problematic that he called for a stay in the trial. That's why those hearings haven't happened. And until the parties involved have come to some sort of an agreement, that trial will remain stayed indefinitely.
All right. Let's talk with Nick here. Since we're talking about states first, and Nick is a longtime watcher of Live with NORML and mentions that Senator Streets introduced a memo for legalization in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's Pennsylvania. So he essentially issued a Dear Colleague letter making it clear that he intends to reintroduce a legalization bill, and he's looking, obviously, to get a number of his colleagues to sign on as co-sponsors of the bill before he formally drops it. We've known for some time that there is going to be legislative debate in Pennsylvania about legalization. In fact, they've already had informational hearings prior to any bill being dropped. But there is no clear sign at this point that there is a consensus among lawmakers in Pennsylvania as to what legalization ought to look like. There's been some debate whether it should be run through state-sponsored stores, which would be a very controversial position. No state has done that for good reason. But there are some folks, proponents of legalization, that are pushing that model in Pennsylvania. There's others that are pushing back against it. And of course, you have the majority of Republicans in Pennsylvania who oppose legalization under any model. So I think there's going to be further debate in Pennsylvania, but it is not a state where I am particularly hopeful that there is going to be a bill that can reach the governor's desk in this session.
Yeah, don't be led astray by what you might read in those listicles about the next states to legalize. And let's start with the email that we sent out earlier this week, Paul. It's also available to read on the front page of NORML.org. Cannabis freedoms are under attack, and this is going to dovetail with a lot of what we are going to talk about in our other stories this week. Marijuana consumers across the nation are under siege, and NORML is fighting back, and we've been successful. For those of you who've been watching so far this year, we've been successful in thwarting a number of bad bills, 4 in particular in Virginia, and a few more in other states. Do you want to add anything on this particular top level discussion before we get into the nitty gritty, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. I think folks who care about this issue need to be aware that historically we've had quite a bit of success at the state level. And I think a lot of folks have grown used to the fact that when you push forward legalization, oftentimes you'll win. And many folks that are somewhat new to this issue have really never been through an environment where opponents push back really hard. And right now, we are in such an environment. We are seeing in Republican-led states, lawmakers moving with urgency to repeal voter-approved legalization and to recriminalize marijuana and recriminalize marijuana consumers. Conversely, in Democratic-led states, we're also having to fight battles right now that we haven't had to fight in the past because we have governors and lawmakers in those states where marijuana is already legal seeking to significantly raise the taxes on marijuana in such a manner that it would essentially make the legal marijuana market cost prohibitive. So we're essentially fighting 2 different battles right now on 2 different fronts. In these Republican-led states, we're trying to hang on to our gains and make it so lawmakers don't recriminalize marijuana so that responsible cannabis users don't end up back in jail. And in these Democratic-led states, we're trying to send the message that, hey, responsible consumers aren't ATM machines. They're not here to fix your budget crisis. So regardless of sort of where the politics lie in the states where you live right now, we are fighting to maintain the gains that we fought so hard to achieve over the last few decades. And as you said, JM, in some cases, we're successfully fighting back. Look, in South Dakota, a bill was introduced to outright repeal voter-approved medical marijuana access, despite the fact that law passed with 70% of the vote. Nonetheless, Republicans lined up to strike the law down altogether, and they almost succeeded. That bill failed by 1 vote. That's how close the battle was in South Dakota. In Ohio, where we passed legalization with 57% of the vote, we just saw members of the state Senate this week overwhelmingly vote to roll back that law, to recriminalize gifting of marijuana between one adult to another, to make it a new crime to go outside of the state of Ohio, buy a legal marijuana product, and come back to Ohio with that product. That will be illegal under the law, that under the proposal that Republicans in Ohio just passed. And yes, I mean Republicans. Every Republican in the Senate voted for that bill. And I've got unfortunate news for folks. Now that bill goes to the House, and more than 2/3 of that House is Republican. If they want to pass that bill, they have the numbers to pass it, despite the fact that we've generated in the last few weeks over 16,000 communications to lawmakers in that state telling them to oppose this bill. I was just attending a hearing in Montana yesterday where lawmakers in that state are seeking to decimate the legal adult use industry in Montana, to end 7,000 jobs in Montana by passing a THC potency cap that wouldn't allow for the sale of any marijuana product above 15% THC. Nearly half of the senators in the Montana Senate are co-sponsors of that bill. And if you read the language of that bill, it compares the sale of marijuana products with more than 15% THC to slavery. It's in the text of the bill. Anybody can read it. That is the sort of pressure we are up against right now. There is a bill right now moving forward in Idaho that would change the Constitution so that there could never be a voter initiative on the ballot that would ask voters whether or not they wanted to legalize marijuana. That is a real bill that is making its way through the Idaho legislature right now. These are all Republican-led bills. These are all in states that have strong Republican majorities. We are pushing back the best we can, but it is an uphill battle. And folks need to be aware that the tide has turned in many of these states. Marijuana is no less popular among the public now than it's been, but it is certainly less popular among many of these elected officials who see an opportunity to push back, and they are.
Whew. For those of you who, okay, it's posting on Facebook and on YouTube. I have shared the action alerts, both for the Montana bills that Paul was mentioning and the Idaho action alert regarding ballot initiative process.
And in Ohio, the bill is Senate Bill 56.
Ohio, we have a whole thing about Ohio coming up. Let's do Ohio next, shall we? Since that's seems to be the top of the week when it comes. Well, I mean, how can you pick which is the worst? So this week,
we didn't even mention Nebraska, which I'll mention right now. There's a hearing on Monday in Nebraska on Legislative Bill 483. People may remember that under great duress, activists in Nebraska last year were able to finally put the question of medical marijuana legalization on the ballot. It passed. The law hasn't even been implemented yet, and there is legislation that will be heard on Monday to gut medical marijuana access in Nebraska, to eliminate patients' ability to possess any botanical cannabis or botanical cannabis product. Again, we have an action alert opposing it. And if you are in Nebraska, please make sure you contact your lawmakers, send testimony to the General Affairs Committee, and tell them to vote no. Tell them that elections still matter in America.
Yeah, they really do, and the consequences of the last elections are why we're experiencing this today.
Yeah, by and large, they largely are. The consequences of that election not only did it embolden our political opponents, but it also emboldened and strengthened cultural conservatives and Republicans in many of these GOP-leaning states who were never comfortable with marijuana. They were never comfortable with legalization and marijuana reforms that had been voted into these states. And they looked for and they waited for their opportunity to push back on it. And again, the day has arrived when they're pushing back. I'll mention one other bill as well that's being heard within the next couple of days. In Colorado, there will be a hearing on Tuesday on legislation that would essentially disallow young adults, individuals between the ages of 21 and 25, from accessing the legal adult use marijuana market. That's a bill that's going to be heard on Tuesday. And again, if you go to our Take Action page, we have an alert up on that. I don't have the bill number offhand.
It is Senate Bill 76, and that is a great reminder that I just added a little bit of extra to that Colorado alert. So we have alerts. I have posted in the chat the alert links for everything Paul has just mentioned. We're going to do Ohio next. If you're watching on Instagram, I can't share the links there because they don't work, but you can find all of these in the NORML Take Action Center, which is at norml.org/act. It's norml.org/act. And you'll click on your state and it'll show you the alerts that are pending there. Paul, let's talk about what went down in Ohio this week when the Senate advanced a bill gutting
Right.
the voter-approved legalization law that voters approved in 2023. Just 2023, Ohio legalized, and we saw
And the legalization law only went into effect in August.
Yeah, we saw attempts last year to roll back and rescind provisions of the voter-approved legalization law, and we're seeing them again this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is a Republican-led bill in the Senate. Unfortunately, because Ohio is so gerrymandered, both chambers are terribly lopsided. Republicans possess more than a 2/3 majority in the House and in the Senate, and the governor of Ohio, Governor DeWine, is also a Republican. This is a bill being pushed by Republicans. Like I said, in the Senate, which voted on the bill on Wednesday, every Republican who was present voted for this bill, the gut voter-approved legalization. Every Democrat voted against the bill. Nonetheless, it was still, I believe, 29-9 was the final vote because, again, Republicans are so dominating in that legislature. There's a number of terrible things this bill will do. It will roll back personal cultivation rights that right now are the law. It will make it a criminal offense to use marijuana anywhere beyond one's private residence. Like I said, it actually would make it illegal to possess marijuana that was not purchased at an in-state licensed dispensary, even to the point that if someone crossed state lines, went to another legal state and purchased marijuana, if they brought it back to Ohio, that would be a crime. If two adults gift one another marijuana, that becomes a new crime in Ohio. There are a lot of really terrible things in this bill that are going to have dramatic effects, negative effects on cannabis consumers, and it's going to lead to a whole lot more arrests in the state of Ohio. Like I said, we have done a lot to sound the alarm. We've generated over 16,000 communications from voters and their lawmakers telling them to vote no on this bill. We've published op-eds opposing this bill in some of the largest newspapers in Ohio. And we have made very strong cases when this bill's been heard. There was a hearing 2 weeks ago on this bill. There were 43 witnesses who showed up in person to testify. 42 of them testified against this bill. Only one person testified for it. Nonetheless, every Republican voted for it.
Wild. Wow. Yeah, I just took a look at it, and 16,466 letters from constituents have been sent directly to lawmakers opposing this effort.
Yes, it's certainly not as if lawmakers aren't hearing from the voters, and it's not like lawmakers aren't getting a clear and consistent message from those voters. They're simply ignoring it.
Wow. Well, that's not the only state where they're ignoring voters. Certainly, boy, people in Ohio are certainly feeling the consequences of their elections. And this week, Republican Governor Brad Little signed into a law that will impose new mandatory minimum penalties for simple, low-level, minor marijuana possession.
Correct. Yes, so that Brad Little's the governor of Idaho. Idaho has always been a very culturally conservative state. But again, it's gotten more so. So this bill that you're referring to will take effect now, I believe, July 1st. It is the law in Idaho. Idaho is the first state to now enact mandatory minimum sentencing for low-level marijuana possession offenses. Judges' hands are tied. They have to impose the mandatory minimum sentence now in Idaho for possessing marijuana. To give people some sense of how sort of the political environment has changed, this bill passed overwhelmingly in both chambers in Idaho by more than 2/3 of the vote. A very similar mandatory minimum bill was introduced in Idaho last year. It didn't even get out of committee. That tells you, again, how emboldened our political opponents and these lawmakers have become. Last year, they weren't even willing to consider this legislation. This year, it passes overwhelmingly, and it's now law. You mentioned Ohio earlier. We saw a very similar phenomenon there. In Ohio, lawmakers last year also attempted to roll back voter-approved legalization, but they failed. They eventually realized that doing so was so unpopular with the voters, and they weren't willing to risk the voters' wrath going into an election year. But this year, they don't care.
Why?
Because they were just reelected.
No, I mean, because elections have consequences.
Yeah.
It's what we are. Yeah, exactly. It's garbage in, garbage out, friends. And to this, we've already had to ban one person from the stream. Shocking, I know. But we have to use the words Republican and Democrat to tell you who's doing what. NORML is a nonpartisan organization, but that doesn't mean we don't use both of those words. And thanks, Chris. That's what we're here for. We are here to tell you the truth about what's actually going on around the country when it comes to reforming marijuana laws and the bills that are pending.
Yes. And speaking of Democrats, because I mentioned this in my opening, we're actively opposing efforts that would hurt cannabis consumers in Democratic-led states as well. Look, in New Jersey, the governor just in his proposed budget has just proposed raising taxes on marijuana sales by 500%. By an astronomical amount. New Jerseyans already pay some of the highest prices at retail for marijuana products, more so than anywhere in the country. And here you have a Democratic governor proposing to hike the tax for a special tax from 2.5% to 15%, not seemingly realizing that the only thing that proposal will accomplish is driving consumers away from the legal market, away from their legal retailers, and into the arms of the unregulated market. And it's not only in New Jersey where we're seeing these dumb Democratic-led tax hikes being proposed. In Michigan, Governor Whitmer has proposed raising the special cannabis sales tax to 32%. In Maryland, my home state, we've had meetings with Governor Wes Moore's representatives because the governor is proposing raising the special sales tax on cannabis from 9% to 15%. California is looking at their own tax hike. These are Democratic-led states. They may not realize that they're attacking the legal market, but they are through these onerous tax hikes that consumers can't afford. And we're pushing back against those as well. And I'm not afraid to call those Democratic governors out.
No, it's fascinating to see what each party decides to focus in on when it comes to cannabis policy. For a while, Democrats were super enamored with equity in cannabis licensing. I think that Virginia is still grappling a lot with what licensing means to them, and the fantasy that they're going to solve all of these systemic problems with weed policy.
Right. And again, in these states I've talked about, in Michigan, in Maryland, in New Jersey, California, these are states that are facing significant budget deficits right now. And the fantasy that these Democratic governors have is somehow you can bridge those deficits solely on the backs of marijuana consumers. And that's not the case.
Exactly. And not the industry. This is not asking the industry to pay more. This is exactly what you said, on the backs of consumers. Because time after time, bill after bill, who do we see at the very bottom of the barrel? That's consumers. There is no cannabis industry without cannabis consumers. And the interests that ought to be at the top of every issue, the interests that ought to be centered and considered first are those of consumers. Because
Absolutely.
without consumers, you don't have any of this.
And these are consumers that in every legal state are already paying special taxes on top of state taxes for their cannabis products.
You cannot, if one of the primary objectives of legalization is to dissuade people from engaging with the illicit market and encourage them to purchase products that are legal and regulated for their safety, you're only disincentivizing them when you slap these exorbitant taxes on it, or you have the nearest dispensaries 2.5 hours away. You can't achieve those goals of your public policy.
Right. Absolutely.
When your
And the
policy
irony is,
directly harms the people that are intended to use it.
and the irony is these lawmakers think they're going to increase their existing tax revenue, not realizing that when you cause a mass exodus, when literally tens of thousands of consumers that would otherwise be patronizing the legal market exit that market because you've driven prices so artificially high, then they're actually going to see an overall decrease in the tax revenue. So it's going to backfire for everybody other than those who profit in the illicit marketplace, who are going to have a boon of new business.
Okay, we had so many comments come in during our sermon, Paul. And I want to say, yes, thank you to everyone who said great things. I see you all. Thank you, Chris and DJ and Sativa and Christopher Brady and David and John and Woodyard for your thoughts and for sharing them. Hey, Brian, good to see you as well. Hey, JT. Brian, I'm going to read your comment out loud because I can't keep making this face. Brian is asking this question, Paul. Please play along with me. Will you consider grass tax and the federal minimum payment can allow tax write-up registration to prevent district collector I don't know what that means. Do you?
I don't either. And I believe he's referring to New York's cannabis market, but I'm not necessarily sure about that either. So no, unfortunately, I don't have enough information there to answer.
Brian, tell us more in the comments, and we'll try to answer your question. David, thank you. And David, I also want you to know that I was talking with the delegate about your tax issue just mere moments ago. That we are what he told you was correct when what I told you was correct, and so we're all good. Don't worry. I told you, don't worry. Okay, we talked about North Dakota. No, we talked about Idaho. We talked about Ohio. Let's
We
talk
talked about Montana.
We talked about Montana. Let's talk about, we have a story from North Dakota this week. Let's take a minute and do something that's a little less terrible. In North Dakota, the House approved legislation to reduce penalties for marijuana possession.
Yes, they did. Overwhelmingly.
Good job, North Dakota.
Yes. So for folks who may not be living in North Dakota, which I assume is almost everybody, the way North Dakota's possession law works right now is that they have partially decriminalized possession of up to half an ounce of marijuana. So what that means is under the statute, if you are found possessing small amounts of marijuana, the police will issue you a citation. You have to appear in court when you receive that citation. You have to pay court costs. And if you are found guilty or if you plead guilty, you will have a criminal record because it is still considered a criminal offense, but it is not a criminal offense that's punishable by jail time. So a person won't be arrested and they don't have the possibility of going to jail, but they will be considered a criminal. They will have to go to court. They will have to pay fines. So what has been proposed right now in North Dakota is to fully decriminalize possession of half an ounce. It would reclassify it from a criminal offense to a non-criminal infraction. Essentially, it would become a civil offense. So a person would still receive a citation, they would pay a fine, they would no longer have to go to court, and they would not have a criminal record. It also partially decriminalizes possession of half an ounce to 100 grams. So in that situation, a person would still have to deal with court costs, but they wouldn't face potential jail time. That's also an improvement over the current law because someone who possesses larger amounts of marijuana can be punishable by 30 days in jail. So it is a good bill. It's a bill we're supporting. The House passed it by a margin of about 7-1, and now it goes to the Senate. And we are very hopeful that North Dakota might be one of the few GOP-led states this year that really bucks this trend we've been talking about and is moving to actually reduce penalties, not enhance them.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? Let's I need to go get the link for New Hampshire. But Paul, why don't you talk about the 3 bills that New Hampshire's House advanced to the Senate this week? And I know that we're uncertain as to what fate they may meet there.
We're fairly certain. So yes, so New Hampshire, as folks probably know, this is a state where every year there seems to be fairly serious legislative debate about legalization and other changes. As in past years, the House of Representatives have advanced a number of different marijuana reform bills that we support. One would be a bill to simply eliminate all criminal and civil penalties for anyone who possesses marijuana over the age of 21. So essentially legalizing the possession and use of marijuana, but not addressing any sort of regulated market. There is another bill that we support that would allow patients to home cultivate medical marijuana. Right now, medical marijuana is legal in New Hampshire, but home cultivation is not legal. Patients must buy their marijuana products from state licensed dispensaries. And then there's a third bill that was passed by the House that would facilitate a process to annul. So people with past marijuana convictions could have those convictions annulled. All 3 of those bills passed by voice votes. This is not uncommon. Similar bills continually are passed by the House, but they typically go to die in the Senate. That is likely going to be the case this year. And I say that with relative certainty because, again, elections have consequences. And in this last election, New Hampshire voters elected Nicole Ayotte to be the governor of New Hampshire. Governor Ayotte hates marijuana. Governor Ayotte's been very public over the course of her political career that she hates marijuana and made it clear that as governor, she has no intention of signing marijuana legalization or other reform policies, very much like your governor, JM. And I'm sorry, but I take them at their word. And when they tell us they're not going to legalize marijuana and they're not going to support these bills if they get to their desk, I believe them. In the case of New Hampshire, the Senate largely runs cover for the governor. So if the Senate knows the governor has no intention of passing these bills, they're just going to let the bills die due to inactivity. They're not going to send them to the governor's desk and force her to veto bills. So unfortunately, despite the House support, like we see every year in New Hampshire, I don't expect the Senate to take action on any of these bills.
All right. Paul, are there any other state issues that you want to cover? And for anyone watching, Paul's going to be with us for maybe like 10 more minutes or so. So if you have state questions or federal questions, now's a really good time to ask those and to ban this person. Sorry, you can't sell weird stuff in our live streams. I think we've told them too much information, because usually we have a lot of questions and we're just rapid fire at you all this week. DJ says, I've been hearing a lot about Arkansas lately too.
So what he's probably been hearing is Arkansas passed and the governor signed into law a bill that reallocates taxes from medical marijuana. Now, personally, I'm of the opinion, and NORML's largely of the opinion, that medicine shouldn't be taxed. We don't traditionally tax prescription medicines. And if marijuana is a medicine, I certainly think it should be treated the same way. Unfortunately, there are a handful of states, fortunately only a handful, but there's a minority of states like Arkansas that saw passing medical marijuana access as something that was less about helping patients and more about trying to raise tax revenue. So in Arkansas, they do tax it. Those taxes were largely going into the general fund, but due to this new bill, that a portion of those taxes will be earmarked to pay for food, student services, and student meals in the public schools. And there was some publicity when that bill was signed. And certainly, if taxes have to go somewhere, that's not a bad place for them to go. But once again, it's on the backs of cannabis consumers. And in the case of Arkansas, patients.
Yeah, we do not tax medical cannabis in Virginia for that exact reason. It's considered medicine. Now, we've had some really wild proposals all over the place when it comes to how we ought to tax adult use in the Commonwealth. And fortunately, they've been listening to a lot of what we've been saying. And they're deeply concerned, at least Democrats are, deeply concerned about how Virginia consumers will transition to the illicit, away from the illicit market, particularly given this, what could ultimately have been a 5 or 6 year gap from the date that legalization took effect until stores are actually open, given Governor Youngkin's inability to grasp what the policy objectives of legalization are. So we're looking at, like a 10% tax here, with then the ability for a small local tax as well. Yeah, and we're also looking at, in the next session, you may have heard Delegate Krizak talk about revisiting where those tax dollars go. Our original proposal that came out of the marijuana legalization task force was to put a significant portion of it to pre-K, because there was not universal pre-K in Virginia. And that's how it was in the original bill. And then it, some other iterations put money other places, and then we're going to go back to where we started next year.
I see someone in the chat asked about Wyoming and Montana. There was a bill in Wyoming that was introduced to decriminalize marijuana. That bill has died. It died due to inactivity. That's what we call as a bill being tabled, which essentially means it was either assigned to a committee and that committee elected not to hear it, or in some cases, it simply wasn't assigned to a committee at all, and therefore it died by default. But what it means is lawmakers didn't even consider enough about that bill, or it didn't have enough support to even warrant a hearing and a discussion or a vote. In Montana, we talked earlier, there's two bills in Montana that we are strongly opposing. One would set up a mandatory registry for anyone over 21 who wishes to purchase legal marijuana products. It would force them to have an ID card, which they must have on them at all times. If they possess marijuana without also possessing the ID card, that would be a crime. They have to pay $200 to be in that registry. And the police are able to surveil their purchases once they're part of the registry. So again, this is an effort by lawmakers to essentially kill the legal market in Montana that voters approved. There's a separate bill in Montana that seeks to kill the market by imposing a 15% cap on THC in any adult use legal product. That bill was heard in a committee hearing yesterday. We have pushed back really hard on the surveillance bill, and I believe the sponsor is at least temporarily abandoning his support for that bill, but lawmakers are going full speed ahead on the potency cap bill. So that is our priority right now in Montana, is to defeat that. There's also a third bill in Montana that would impose a moratorium on licenses for any new marijuana businesses. That actually would simply be extending an existing moratorium that has existed almost since the day Montana set up legalization, which they did in 2021. In 2022, lawmakers in Montana said, no more stores. We're passing a moratorium on any new stores, and they've kept that moratorium in place every year since then.
All right. The questions are coming now. Let's take Brady's comment here. Brady says,
Hoosiers. That's a different question.
Here we go. Paul, I am afraid our president and his conservative AF administration is going to roll back existing reform and go back to total prohibition. Am I crazy or what?
Well, here's the thing, Chris. Federal law already is total prohibition. So there's really nothing for the president to roll back. First of all, the president doesn't make law. I know this president seems to think he can, but we have three separate but equal branches of government, and it's the legislative branch, or the Congress, that traditionally makes laws. So the fact is that since 1970, marijuana has been federally illegal due to its placement as a Schedule I controlled substance in the CSA. Congress is the legislative body that made that decision. And ultimately, any change in federal marijuana law has to come from Congress as well. I'm not necessarily convinced that Congress has the appetite to somehow make marijuana even more federally illegal than it is now. But conversely, I also don't think this particular Congress has the appetite to loosen any federal restrictions. But at the end of the day, there's very little the president can do about how states decide to manage marijuana or enact their own marijuana legalization. The rollbacks and proposed rollbacks we're seeing at the state level are coming solely because a majority of state elected officials are choosing to introduce legislation and advance that legislation to roll back these consumer protections, to recriminalize marijuana. It really has nothing to do with what the federal government says or thinks about marijuana right now.
Paul, we're going to get through two questions for you before you.
That's okay. I've got about 15 more minutes, so I'm good.
All right. So Christmas Tree asks about North Dakota advancing a bill reducing marijuana possession penalties. What made that possible, and how can we apply that strategy in Indiana?
Sure. So unfortunately, and in Indiana, there are a number of different bills introduced uh, to address all sorts of different facets of marijuana policy. There were bills introduced to legalize marijuana. There were bills introduced to decriminalize marijuana. There were bills for medical marijuana access. Unfortunately, they've all failed. Indiana is a state that has a crossover date, and if bills are not advanced out of committee by that date, they die due to inaction. And unfortunately, none of those bills were advanced. I can say why lawmakers in North Dakota, also a Republican leaning state, were receptive to arguments there in a way perhaps Indiana lawmakers weren't. Was in North Dakota, the belief is that the current policy for low level partial decriminalization, like I said, that requires an individual to go to court. In fact, they have to have multiple court appearances before they can get the case settled. This was seen in North Dakota as being too expensive. All right. It was costing the state money to have these low level marijuana consumers who can't face jail time to sit in court to simply have their case adjudicated so they could pay a small fine. So essentially, when these consumers were paying the fine, the state was collecting the fine, but it was costing the state more money to get that fine. And that argument resonated with lawmakers in North Dakota that said, why are we spending thousands of dollars to collect a few $100s from these low-level marijuana consumers? And judges in North Dakota also seemed to be publicly upset with this policy. They said, look, we've got real criminals and real serious cases we need to make time to hear in our courtrooms, yet we have this obligatory policy that says low-level consumers have to come through our courts simply so we can adjudicate the case and fine them. It seemed to be the consensus, at least in the House, that that policy didn't make any sense, that North Dakota had partially decriminalized marijuana, but why not simply fully decriminalize it? Because it would be a lot less costly and time consuming for the state to do so. So I think the difference between Indiana and North Dakota is that right now in Indiana, there is no partial decriminalization. Marijuana is fully decriminalized, even low-level possession. In North Dakota, they'd already taken some baby steps a few years ago, enacting partial decriminalization, and now they're just following through with a logical extension to fully decriminalize.
That was fascinating. There's things I didn't know about North Dakota. John has a good question about SB 56 in Ohio, and goes on to say that the bill states that individuals who use marijuana in violation of their employer's policies will not be eligible for unemployment benefits. Suggestions on whether or not this is actually possible to pass.
Look, I'm no lawyer, but my sense is if that's a provision of the bill and it's in there and it passes, it will be the law.
Yeah.
Perhaps after the fact, somebody might litigate this issue, but my guess is that, look, the staff, the aides of these lawmakers, they have folks that they can ask to look into these issues beforehand. And my guess is they probably looked into this and thought they were on solid ground, including those provisions.
I would go as far as to assume that that provision is included at the request of.
I would guess that too. There were, if folks remember the Issue 2 campaign in 2023, one of the most vocal and public opponents of legalization was the Chamber of Commerce and a number of different industries representing construction and other industries. They hated this bill. So I think you're right, JM. My guess is it was representatives from the chamber and some of these industries that probably requested that specific provision.
Yeah, if you are part of an industry group, if you are if you work in manufacturing, or you work in utilities, can't imagine why I'm using those two examples. That's a time to get involved and make sure that the group that purportedly represents you or your industry knows where you and your colleagues stand on these issues, because they are coming for your employment rights. They are coming for your employment protections when it comes to cannabis. We were able to defeat 2 measures like that here in Virginia this year, and I suspect we'll see more of that in other states as well.
Well, I would just add that one of the bills I worked on in January was a bill to abolish pre-employment marijuana screening and also abolish an employer being able to penalize a worker if they test positive for marijuana. And that was in Maryland. So that was an example of where we were able to bring about new protections for consumers in the workplace. So that is a battle that's being fought on all sides right now, where there are efforts in several states to expand these protections, understanding that if marijuana is legal and people are legally consuming on their own time, they shouldn't lose their job over it. And of course, there's other examples of states like in Ohio, like in Virginia, that are trying to push back, that understand that they can strongly dissuade people from using marijuana, even in a legal market, if they know that that legal use can potentially cost people their jobs.
Yeah.
And that's arguably why drug testing became so pervasive in this country in the 1980s and 90s. It had nothing to do with occupational safety. It had everything to do by the folks who proposed it and were proponents of it, who recognized that there weren't enough police to find everyone using marijuana and arrest them. But if most people who used marijuana were employed, which they were, they recognized that if they made using marijuana something that risked people losing their job, that's the way they could discourage people from using marijuana. That's what workplace drug testing was. That was the principle workplace drug testing was founded upon.
Yeah, and it's one of urine testing companies, one of the biggest funders of prohibition today. When it comes to prohibition organization, I shouldn't say, not from a bill standpoint, but from an advocacy standpoint. We all know what we're talking about. We don't say that. We don't say those words on this show. They don't deserve our breath. Scrolling through these comments to see if we have any. David, I see your question. David asks, when Virginia legislators consider tax rates, do they also consider market prices? I wonder if they know what a pound or an ounce costs. No, they don't. Do they know prices have come down? So, David, what they know is they know that prices are high in nascent markets. They know they still consider Virginia's medical program nascent to some degree, even though it's been here for a hot minute. What they understand is the need to not price consumers out of the marketplace. They understand that cannabis prices on the East Coast, and particularly the closer to the South you get, that prices are higher. So they do understand that prices are higher out here, but that's not really what they're. I don't think that's what's influential when it comes to picking a tax rate. It is more so about not pricing consumers out of the.
Yeah, and I want to say something that, this trend we're seeing this year in these Democratic states to push tax hikes is really unique. We have 24 states with legal marijuana markets. There is only one state that over time has ever increased marijuana-related taxes. The trend historically has been for lawmakers to lower taxes in the legal market when they realize that the initial taxes that were imposed were artificially high. So this is a complete pivot from what we've seen in the past, where we've seen historically lawmakers moving to lower taxes. Suddenly this year, we're seeing lawmakers looking to raise taxes. And again, exponentially raise taxes. We're not talking an increase of 1 or 2%. We're talking doubling and tripling existing tax rates.
Insane. I love this comment that I was following what DJ was mentioning in the chat here, talking about whether or not his union has made a public statement, IATSE, about cannabis. And DJ went to look and can share with us that IATSE allots $2,500 a year for medical cannabis. That's pretty amazing. I love that. As a former entertainment person, I love that particularly. Paul, I'm so excited that I get to ask you this question on behalf of Brady this week, since I have to answer it every week. This will be your last one. Thank you for joining us, by the way. Paul, one last question, asks Brady. It's a whole new world of cannabis out there these days. What's your favorite type of cannabis?
Cannabis that's affordable and legal.
I love it. That's great. You know my answer is always legal cannabis, but I think affordable is good. Maybe like safe in there too. Okay.
Absolutely. I would add as well that it probably goes without saying, but there's been so much hybridization over the years of botanical cannabis that the terms sativa and indica are essentially meaningless. So again, just a word to the wise for folks out there. Despite what your bud tender may tell you, there really are no pure indica strains and no pure sativa strains. And to try to equate specific effects to one or the other also is a bit of a fool's errand. Cannabis is cannabis at this point.
I would say that this audience is probably you're not going to see anyone talking about sativa and indica in this chat. I think they've heard that message loud and clear. But I'm so glad you brought that up. I do love
Absolutely. Well, JM, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to talk to folks about what is going on politically at the state level. And I'd be remiss if I left without encouraging folks to go to NORML's Take Action page. We're now tracking over 70 different bills. About 15 or 16 of those are bad bills we're opposing. But conversely, there's about 50 or so bills that we're supportive of. And there are opportunities, like in North Dakota, like in other states, to also pass substantive marijuana changes in many states as well. We have those opportunities too. So I don't want folks to leave here totally discouraged, but I want them to have a healthy understanding that we are under attack right now. Much of what I said today was inspired by a rather clickbait article that appeared on another marijuana website that was titled 12 states that might legalize marijuana in 2025. The fact is that sort of messaging doesn't help. It sets expectations among the marijuana community unrealistically high. It tells a false narrative, and it's avoiding the elephant in the room that says right now the battle in many states isn't about who's going to legalize next. It's about how we're going to hold the line to maintain the gains that we worked so hard to achieve, because those gains are under assault right now. That's what folks need to know. Not to get discouraged, but to remember that we are the majority. And we have to act like we're the majority, and we have to push back against these efforts and make it clear that there's a reason we went from 0 adult use legalization states in 2012 to 24 today. And that's because the American public, the majority of the American public, agrees with us and doesn't agree with these folks that are looking to recriminalize cannabis and put folks like us back in cages.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for being here. Everyone, say bye to Paul. I'm going to stay with you for a minute, and we're going to talk about a few more things before we break for the weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, friends. That was awesome. You all had great questions. Let's talk about let's talk about some events that are coming up. So I've mentioned this to you all a few times now. In March, which starts tomorrow, I can't believe that. March 14th and 15th is the 2025 Kentucky Cannabis Conference and Expo. Let me get you the link. Thank you, Brady. Let me give you the link for that. You can find all of this on their website, which is kynormal.org. If you're watching on Instagram, you're going to find Kentucky Normal on Instagram as well, but it's kynormal.org is their website. The Kentucky Cannabis Conference and Expo, March 14th and 15th. And I believe that tickets go on sale very soon for the National Cannabis Festival. This happens in DC, July 18th and 19th this year. It's on the RFK campus in DC, July 18th and 19th. There will also be, and I knew the day and I didn't put it in here. There's also the National Cannabis Policy Summit, which I wanted to find and share with you. And why is it not on here? Well, is it in 420 week? Is that when it is? Maybe it's not been announced online yet, but there will be a policy summit coming up as well in DC in April. So check all of this out at nationalcannabisfestival.com. If you're watching on Instagram, you can find National Cannabis Festival there or on their website, of course. Those are the only two events I had to tell you about this week. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Love hanging out with you on Friday afternoons. Make sure you hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live. We try to do this every week, every Friday at 4. Santa Fe, no. Santa Fe says, so is weed legal for all the states now, as it should have been like 13 years ago? No, it's not. There are plenty of states in which cannabis is not legal for adult use. Every state except for Idaho has some type of cannabis use allowance, though there are still a handful of states, like Indiana is restricted to CBD. Some states don't have real meaningful medical cannabis access yet, so still plenty of work to be done. And regardless of, even if legalization were the law of the land in every state and territory, cannabis consumers still deserve representation in the public policy debate surrounding cannabis, because there is no industry without those consumers. And that's what NORML does. NORML represents the interests of responsible cannabis consumers. So we've been here representing you for coming up on 55 years. And we want to keep doing that. So make sure you join NORML at normal.org/join, so that, I thought they were in front of me, and not, so that I can send you, that's the wrong one, so that I can send you your official member card for 2025. normal.org/join. John says, how many states have legislators that don't listen to the voters? Every single one, John does. Also, there are, if you want to see where your elected officials or the candidates who may be on your ballot soon, if you're a state that has elections coming up like Virginia, you can check out our voter guide at vote.normal.org. It's called Smoke the Vote, and it's here to help you make really informed choices when you head to the ballot box. That's right, DJ. That's why you have to keep calling and contacting your lawmakers. If you want to contact lawmakers about pending cannabis policies in your state, head to normal.org/act. That's our Take Action Center. As Paul mentioned, we are tracking 76 bills there right now. If your state does not have any action alerts up, it doesn't mean there isn't legislation pending. It just means it's not on our radar, or perhaps your legislative session hasn't started yet in your state. You can always reach out to us if you have questions. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, ya boy, for telling me that it's April 17th. I knew I had read the email and I couldn't remember. Like, it just was in there somewhere and I couldn't remember. The National Cannabis Policy Summit is April 17th. I hope you're right. I'm trusting you. I don't want to open my email in the middle of the show and then, you know, it's finicky. All right, friends. Brownie, me too. All right, friends. Have a great weekend. I'm J.M. Padini, the development director for NORML. I've had a great time hanging out with you all this week. And as always, I'll see you back here next time. Bye-bye.